It is well established that conflict is a part of human nature, as we have been involved in conflicts both large and small throughout our entire existence as a species. These can arise from literally anything, whether it be disagreements or shortages of resources. In an extreme case, in the Middle Ages, 2 Italian city-states were said to have gone to war over a bucket. Clearly the bucket is a worthy cause, but ask yourself, would you go to war over lobsters? This is the situation the nations of Brazil and France found themselves in during the early Cold War, where a conflict between fishermen almost erupted into a military conflict between nations. From ancient times, mankind has yearned to master the seas both for trade and for warfare. As centuries passed, we learned and adapted our seafaring vessels to be stronger and more well-equipped to face off against anything they could encounter. From the ships of the line during the Age of Sail to modern nuclear submarines, this is Sails and Salvos. This video has been brought to you by World of Warships Legends. If you're a fan of naval warfare and own a current or last-gen console, you owe it to yourself to give this game a try. Not only is it free to play, but joining now will let you take part in World of Warship Legends' second birthday celebration, which began on August 12th. With a streamlined user interface and other improved functions specifically for consoles, the game is easy for players of any skill level to play and master. For any anime lovers watching this, you can also take advantage of the collaboration with Arpeggio of Blue Steel to get yourself special ships and commanders with their own unique voiceovers and skills. I personally own one of the custom voice crews in World of Tanks from their collaboration with Girls in Panzer, and it's a really fun addition to spice up the game in my opinion. If you're cringing at the thought of anime voices though, don't worry, because you can instead get yourself the newest campaign reward, which is the ZF6, a well-rounded German destroyer. So head to either the Microsoft or PlayStation Store right now to start your download for free and use the code on screen to get 7 days of premium, the Tier 2 Smith, Tier 2 Aurora, 20 Eco Tile camos, and 20 rare boosters just for being one of my viewers. Once you do that, come right back and we can talk about a war for lobsters. The year is 1963, and the roar of aircraft engines can be heard as a lone RB-17 glides low over the empty ocean. Unlike its cousins that fought in the Second World War, this B-17 is only armed with cameras and other reconnaissance equipment. Flying a few miles off the coast of Brazil, the aircraft is on a mission to find the French destroyer Tartu. Only a few hours after taking off, one of the crew members shouts out, "Ship spotted," and points out the window towards a small vessel only a mile or so away. This is what they have been looking for, the French destroyer that has been the cause of much tension in the area. Progressing ever closer to the destroyer, the crew of the bomber radio in the location of the ship to another destroyer miles away who is armed for half an hour of combat. These units find themselves at the height of the Lobster War between France and Brazil. But how did this begin? The background of the Lobster War originates with French fishermen in the Atlantic Ocean who had been fishing for lobster off the coast of the African country Mauritania. While these fishermen had been very successful in their catches in this location, fishing organizations from the port of Camaret sought after other profitable fishing spots. One of these spots happened to be off the coast of the Brazilian state of Pernambuco, and in 1961 a research permit was granted by Brazilian authorities for 3 French ships to research the lobsters of the area. While this might seem like a completely harmless situation, the only problem was that the Brazilians reported finding that the French ships were not conducting research, but rather trawling for and catching large amounts of lobster, and with 4 ships instead of the allowed 3. With this report, the Brazilian officials rescinded the research permit and ordered the French ships to leave the area in April 1961. In November of the same year, the French ships returned but positioned themselves outside of Brazilian waters on the continental shelf. The interactions between the Brazilians and the French fishermen remained like this for the rest of the year, with the Brazilians closely watching the French right outside of their territorial waters. This all changed on the 2nd of January 1962 with the seizure of the French fishing boat Cassiope for fishing lobster without a permit from the Brazilian government. This can be said to be the turning point of the conflict, as it marked the beginning of the involvement of the French and Brazilian federal governments. It is important to note that at this time there was not a consensus around the world as to the aspects of territorial waters. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which would establish the boundaries of territorial waters, would only come into effect in 1982, nearly 20 years later. Due to this, disagreements on fishing rights were very common around this point in the 20th century. In the case of the Lobster War, the two nations made claims as to why they should have the rights to fishing off the coast of Brazil. The Brazilian side stated that the lobsters found off the coast are important to its economy and that their government had the right to regulate the industry. The French side countered this by using the Geneva Convention of the Law of the Sea, which outlined fishing rights on the high seas. It is during the negotiations between the two nations that the arguments of what exactly a lobster was came about. This was necessary due to the lobsters living on the continental shelf, and it was the goal of the Brazilians to show that the lobsters are a part of the shelf, while the French goal was to show that they were not. The French proposal was that lobsters should be considered a fish because they move around on the seafloor by walking and jumping. When they undergo a jump, they are then swimming in the ocean and therefore are a fish. This would mean that they are not part of the continental shelf and therefore are free to be fished without Brazilian regulation. Of course, the Brazilians did not accept this. Brazilian Navy officer Paulo de Castro Moriare da Silva stated in response, "By analogy, if a lobster is a fish because it moves in leaps, then the kangaroo is a bird." While these discussions were happening at the federal scale, the French fishermen were apparently not fazed as they returned once more to the continental shelf. As to be expected, the Brazilian response was the same. 3 more fishing boats were seized and their captains ordered to sign a statement that they would not return upon being released. In response, the French sent another diplomatic congregation to Brazil in early 1963 to potentially secure fishing rights towards the lobsters. It was reported that this congregation made the statement to the Brazilians that more fishing boats were headed to Brazil at the time, which prompted the Brazilians to request that they be turned back as they would not give permission to the fishermen during negotiations. It is likely that the Brazilians had in mind to not give permission whether or not they were in discussions with the French, as it was reported by Time that they had discovered that the French catches were scoring $3 million worth of exports, $3 million not going to Brazil. Brazilian President João Goulart, in a surprising move, issued a presidential order that gave 3 French boats that were recently released the permission to fish. You can imagine the response this would get from the Brazilian public, and especially the fishing community of northern Brazil. As such, this permission was rescinded by the government. Sometime in late February, Goulart's tone changed dramatically with an ultimatum to the French that they would have 48 hours to withdraw all fishing boats from Brazilian waters in the continental shelf. Naturally, this did not go well with the French, with President Charles de Gaulle ordering the French Navy to become involved by sending a destroyer to protect the fishing boats. This can be said to be the change from souring relations between the two nations into hostile relations, as the Brazilian Foreign Minister Hermes Lima stated that this was an act of hostility and that our government will not retreat. The lobster will not be caught. While one destroyer being sent to Brazil would not seem like a large escalation, it was not the destroyer that the Brazilian Navy was entirely concerned with, it was the fleet that she had been dispatched from. Off the coast of Africa sat a French task force headed by the aircraft carrier Clemenceau, who herself had 1 cruiser and over 7 destroyers as an escort. Clemenceau and her escorts were only about 3 days away from Brazil, and this worried the Brazilians as to the possibility of their involvement in the affair. The Brazilians themselves had a respectable naval force for a South American nation at the time, even sporting their own aircraft carrier. In the capital of Brasilia, Goulart and his ministers decided that the best course of action was to mobilize both the Navy and Air Force. The only problem with this decision was that they had made this choice on the eve of Carnival, and many of their personnel were on shore leave and vacation. Nevertheless, they were able to gather their men and mobilize 2 task forces, one comprising the cruiser Almirante Tamandaré and 4 destroyers, and another comprising the cruiser Almirante Barroso destroyers and a submarine. This latter task force was to head to the northeast and was dispatched after the first. As with many nations, these mobilizations were to be called scheduled exercises in case any questions were raised. However, the Brazilians ran into other problems. These task forces needed supply ships while they were at sea, and especially if they were to go into battle. The Brazilian Navy did not have their own tankers and needed to lease one from the Brazilian oil company Petrobras. In addition, some of the Brazilian warships themselves were in relatively poor condition. Nearly the entire Navy was World War II vintage ships bought from the United States, with the exception of the aircraft carrier Minas Gerais, which was formerly British. While many of the destroyers were in good condition, this was not entirely the case with the main muscle of the fleet, the 2 light cruisers previously mentioned, Tamandaré and Barroso. It is reported that these ships had problems with their boilers. Tamandaré required repairs that would take at least 15 days, and Barroso was only able to sail with half of her boilers operational. Barroso also found itself in the position of not having ammunition for its main guns, one turret inoperable, and 2 others being manually controlled by the crew rather than automated. 4 of her 6 firing radars were also inoperable. Problems with the ships were only bolstered by an inspection by the Admiralty on the entire fleet. It was found that there was only enough ammunition to last 30 minutes in battle, and that the Navy's depots were only capable of replenishing the ammunition of 20mm guns. In addition, damage control systems and evacuation equipment were found to be in abhorrent condition with the exception of the Pará class, former American Fletcher class destroyers. In terms of their naval capabilities, the Lobster War came at a terrible time for the Brazilian Navy. The Brazilian Air Force was not in the greatest condition either, as their involvement was primarily for reconnaissance purposes. Their aircraft consisted of B-17s, P-2 Neptunes, and S-2 trackers, the latter of which being capable of anti-submarine warfare. It can be said that the trackers were the most advanced of the fleet, as they were equipped with advanced electronics, some of these being Doppler radars, magnetic anomaly detectors, electric countermeasures, and search radar. In comparison, the French fleet consisted of relatively modern ships and aircraft. For instance, the Tartuffe was only commissioned 5 years earlier in 1958. Clemenceau was essentially brand new, being commissioned in 1960, as opposed to Minas Gerais originally being commissioned in the British Royal Navy in 1945. Unlike Clemenceau, Minas Gerais only operated helicopters at the time and did not have any fixed-wing aircraft. While there are no specific reports from this time about an inspection of the readiness of the French fleet, it can be assumed that they were in much better condition than the Brazilians. These problems found the Brazilians in a situation where they were down 1 cruiser as Tamandaré was removed from the battle plans due to her boiler problems. On the 24th of February, the dispatched ships from Rio de Janeiro only consisted of 2 destroyers, Parana and the aptly named Pernambuco, a far cry from the planned task force of a cruiser and 4 destroyers. On the 26th, the Brazilian Air Force discovered the location of the Tartuffe, and on the 27th, a B-17 was able to photograph the ship. The location of the destroyer was consistently relayed to the aforementioned 2 Brazilian ships, with Parana finally reaching Tartuffe on the 28th. The Parana would shadow her French counterpart until the 2nd of March, when she steamed back to Africa and was replaced by the Aviso Paul Goffni, a surprise for the Brazilians since she was significantly less capable than Tartuffe as a warship. Eventually, more Brazilian ships were sent to the area as reinforcements, but despite this buildup of ships, the conflict at sea was resolved peacefully when the Paul Goffni and 4 fishing boats left and returned to Africa on March 10th. Upon confirmation of the French dispatch, the Brazilian Navy began to demobilize and return to peacetime operations. The official end to the Lobster War can be said to be the agreement signed between France and Brazil, which gave explicit authorization for 26 French fishing ships and boats to fish for lobsters in Brazilian waters for 5 years. The only stipulation was that they would give portions of their profits to Brazilian fishermen in the areas. In addition, it can be said that the Brazilians effectively won the Lobster War due to the Brazilians extending their territorial waters to 200 nautical miles, 370 kilometers, an exceptionally large area, especially when normal territorial waters are regulated at 12 miles. So what lessons does the Lobster War present us with? Primarily, it can be concluded from this that many nations during the Cold War and even today are too easily willing to resort to military action in response to disagreements. While the lobsters were and still are important natural resources, are they really significant enough to risk a war over? This is especially the case with the Brazilians, as their navy at the time was not in the position to be in a conflict with a modern navy like that of France's. A war might have seen them humiliated at sea and caused significant political repercussions for the nation and its government. Whether or not this can be seen as a victory for Brazil, President Goulart found himself facing a revolt by sailors of the Brazilian Navy and eventually a full-scale coup by the military in 1964. However, this is a story for another time, and for now we can look back and learn from the Lobster War for what not to do in terms of geopolitical responses to relatively small resource disagreements. Huge thanks to Lord Captain Teapot for working on the script for this video, and as always to my Conley fans who helped to make this content possible through their support. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of this series. One last reminder to check out today's sponsor, World of Warships Legends, for your console of choice and to grab your limited edition plushie before they're gone forever. I'll leave links in the description for your convenience. See you in the next video.